Hello, this is the third of a series of videos dealing with the expansion of Imperial Russia in East Asia. This one dealing with the period from 1875 through to the momentous year 1895. The Russo-Chinese border was redrawn in Russia's favor in 1860 by the Treaty of Peking, and in 1875 the Treaty of St. Petersburg established a mutually acceptable relationship with Japan, building on what was then 20 years of amicable relations. From a Russian perspective, relations with East Asia then remained stable until the 1890s, both China and Japan busily undertaking significant changes designed to make them stronger and more efficient nations, whilst for its part Russian attention was again fixed mostly on Europe. One example of this relative Russian disinterest, or perhaps just recognition of comparative powerlessness in the East, occurred in 1883, when the newly appointed German head of the Korean Customs Service advised the Koreans to counter growing Japanese influence by employing Russian army instructors and providing the Russians with a port. In the face of British opposition, however, nothing came of this. In maritime East Asia, Britain, with its strong local naval presence, clearly wielded more power than Russia. Russian policy changed dramatically in 1891, when the then Tsar, Alexander III, announced a massive project to build a railway across Siberia, to link European Russia with the Russian port of Vladivostok on the Sea of Japan. When completed, such a railway was expected to integrate the Russian Far East more effectively within the empire and promote its economy. But it also had tremendous strategic importance as an assertion of Russian power in East Asia and the Pacific. Clearly, the railway line could carry troops and military equipment as easily as it could carry trade goods. I discussed the Trans-Siberian Railway in more detail in a separate video. A second change occurred in 1894-95 when Japan's dramatic and overwhelming victory over China in the Sino-Japanese War gave it at least temporary military superiority in East Asia and signaled that China was much weaker than was generally supposed in Europe. Japanese superiority was underlined by their demands, written into the concluding Treaty of Shimonoseki at the conclusion of the war, by which Japan agreed to cede to Japan Formosa, the Pescadores Islands, and an eastern section of the Liaodong Peninsula, including the strategic base of Port Arthur with its fortifications and arsenals. This shift of power in East Asia presented the Russians with a choice if they wished to remain influential in East Asia. One possibility would be to cooperate with Japan at the further and future expense of China. Another choice would be to defend China against Japan. The Russian political elite were divided as to the best course of action. The new Tsar, Nicholas II, who had only just come to the throne, was young and inexperienced, and his chief advisers had different views. Some, like the then foreign minister, Prince Labanov-Rostovsky, wanted to avoid conflict with Japan and were willing to accept Japan's gains in exchange for Russia gaining compensation in the form of an ice-free port in Korea. But at a conference of ministers on the 11th of April, 1895, the influential finance minister, Sergei Witt, who was strongly opposed to this approach, arguing that if Japan became firmly established on the Asian mainland, she would quickly build up her power, and Russia would find it hard to later dislodge her. The best policy would be for Russia to gain time until the Trans-Siberian Railway was completed, enabling Russian strength to be maximized in the region. Russia should therefore pose as the friend of China and prevent the annexation of any Chinese territory by Japan or any other powers. The Tsar was convinced, and this was the view that prevailed. Japan would be allowed to take offshore islands, but nothing on the Asian mainland. From this point onwards, Russia adopted a far more assertive policy in East Asia, albeit that with different imperial advisors and cliques, the development and expression of Russian policy was not always clear. Several elements underlying the Russian approach to East Asia can be discerned during this period. One was the belief that economic expansion in the East would greatly benefit the Russian economy. Whilst the Russian economy was primitive and underdeveloped compared to the main Western European powers, in the East competitive advantage might lie with the Russians, and East Asia, particularly China, represented a vast potential market for Russian goods. Russia could also become a conduit for European trade and investment in East Asia, particularly after the Trans-Siberian Railway was completed. East Asia also had raw materials, such as timber, which could be exploited by the Russians, the Tsar himself at one point becoming closely involved with a Russian company that aimed to exploit Korean timber. Again, a desire for Russian expansion could be satisfied in the East, and would compensate for the frustration of Russian expansionism in the Balkans. There was also a paranoid fear, shared by both Tsar Nicholas and his German cousin, Kaiser Wilhelm II, in what came to be called the Yellow Peril. This was the racist idea that European civilization was now threatened by the vast multitudes of East Asia, in the same way that it had once been threatened by the Mongols. As the easternmost European power, some Russians, notably the Tsar himself, saw Russia as the primary bulwark against the imagined Asiatic hordes. Wilhelm II, I should add, happily encouraged the Tsar in this belief, seeing it as a practical means of diverting Russian attention away from European questions, including stating that Russia should certainly control Korea to counter the Japanese threat. Russian pragmatists might find these ideas far-fetched, but in a political system that was still ultimately an absolute monarchy, the task of countering the Tsar's convictions was not an easy one. The April conference decision quickly had practical effects, leading almost immediately to the Russian-led triple intervention of the 23rd of April 1895, when, together with France and Germany, the Russians demanded that the Japanese annexation of mainland Chinese territory, detailed in the Treaty of Shimonoseki on the 17th of April, a mere 6 days prior, be nullified. Although China's indemnity payment to Japan was significantly increased by way of compensation, this was a humiliating loss for the Japanese, and was deeply resented. 40 years of cordial relations with Russia had been effectively ended. A Russian loan provided by French banks soon enabled China to pay the enormous indemnity it owed to Japan, whilst at the same time placing the Chinese firmly in Russia's debt. This intervention marked a dramatic shift in the course of East Asian history, as we will see in the next video. Thank you for listening.